Thanks, Ron, and thank you to Mansi and ILSI North America for inviting me here to speak. It's very nice to be involved in this workshop. So I'm Cian. I work with a company called Crème Global. We're a data science company based in Dublin, Ireland. And one of our areas of expertise is food safety modelling and software. So I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done in the area of food packaging safety, and in particular focusing on the exposure assessment part of food safety and chemical food safety for food contact materials, because it's really the area where there's a lot of work to be done in terms of refining your risk assessment and understanding what consumer risk really is from an exposure perspective. So I'm a mathematician by training, which I'll apologize for up front, but I've spent most of my career working with the food industry, and I like putting some equations on my slides, but I'll try and keep them as straightforward as possible, and this is the simplest one I have. So to understand dietary exposure to any chemical that can be present in food, you need to know two inputs essentially. You need to know how much of the food people consume, and you need to know the level of the chemical present in the food. Now this equation becomes very, very complicated when you consider the reality, particularly for food contact materials and food packaging. So people consume foods in different amounts and different combinations, different frequencies at different life stages in the diet, and chemicals can occur in different food contact materials which are used in different combinations for different food applications, and you have different levels of migration of those chemicals into food. So understanding this question with any kind of accuracy or detail beyond the kind of screening type calculations that we saw earlier on that Jason and Kirk presented requires a bit of work, and I want to talk about how we can refine it. So I'm not a regulatory affairs expert or anything like that. I'm just going to talk a bit about the science of how we can develop more refined estimates of consumer exposure. And everything I'm going to present is going to be tilted towards a kind of European perspective, which hopefully will be useful in discussions we're going to have today as well. So the European model, or the kind of the regulatory model of how you estimate exposure for food contact materials is as follows. So it assumes that people consume 1 kilo of food in the diet, and it's in contact with a cube of side 1 decimeter. So people consume 1 kilo of food that's in contact with 6 decimeters squared of food packaging. And the migration of the chemical occurs at the specific migration limit. And it's usually a 60 kilo person that's assumed to be the 60 kilo adult is consumed to be the consumer body weight. So you can estimate your consumer exposure using this model. So you have a kind of a one-to-one correspondence with this, because it's 1 kilo, and usually the specific migration limit is measured in milligrams per kilo. You have a one-to-one correspondence with your exposure and your specific migration limit. This is very, very useful and very quick to apply, and if you find that your exposure is appreciably low, then you don't need to do any more. But this model becomes very unhelpful if you find your exposure is too high and you want to refine it. So the question I would propose then, or pose, is then how do you refine your exposure assessment beyond these kind of screening calculations? So going back to our equation again, so you have two inputs and you want to provide more detail around these things. So the amount of food, you want better data on food consumption. You want to know more about, you don't want to just assume that people are consuming 1 kilo of food, or I think it was 3,000 or 3 kilos for an adult in the US model. And similarly, there's default factors for infants and so on. So you want better data for this. And equally, you want to know better what the level of migration from packaging is, and you want to have a kind of a realistic and refined estimate for the level of chemical in food. And a lot of the methodology I'm going to present is going to be is what was carried out in a project in Europe called the FACET project. So it stands for Flavorings, Additives and Food Contact Materials Exposure Task. It's now renamed Exposure Tool. It was a European framework project that ran from 2008 to 2012. I'm happy to say it's still going. We still have an active packaging industry group who are funding updates, and is in partnership with the Joint Research Centre, which is part of the European Commission. We're still doing updates to this software and model. So the aim of the project was to develop databases on two things. So we wanted better data on food consumption at a European level, and we wanted better data on the occurrence of chemicals in those foods. So again, knowing those two things means you can have a much more refined exposure assessment. We want to develop some models and tools then. So one was a migration model for multi-layer packaging. I'm going to talk a bit about the details of that. The toxicity side of food contact materials, we heard a lot about that already this morning, but there was a QSAR tool based on the OECD toolbox that was developed for the project as well to estimate the toxicity of food contact materials, and finally we wanted an exposure software that would house all of these tools and databases that people can use to look at refined estimates of consumer exposure to food packaging substances in Europe. One of the major strengths of this project was the packaging industry involvement. So we had loads of different sectors of the packaging industry came together to form an overall facet industry group. So we had a group that was itself composed of different sector associations. So we had the plastics manufacturers, Plastics Europe, so the people who make the raw materials, the resins. We had Flexible Packaging Europe. We had European Plastics Converters. We had metal packaging represented by MPAC. We had the can coatings industry represented by CEPI. We had the paper and board industry, so we had SITPA, who represented the people who construct the actual paper and board packaging. We had CEPI, who represented the paper mills. We had the European Printing Inks Association, UPIA. We also had the adhesives, and there was a couple others as well in and around the fringes. All of these companies came together, and they don't always get on because they all buy and sell to each other, but in fairness to them, because of strong leadership within the project, they came together and they provided data for use in the exposure model. So this is a key input, and I think it's worth stressing that this data can be provided if there's a will to do so. So usually these kind of initiatives stop very, very quickly because people are afraid to provide the data, but I'm just saying it's been done and it can be done again if needs be. So I'm going to describe the model that we developed for refined exposure to food contact materials. And it all is based around food consumption data. So we don't want to make a default assumption that everybody consumes a kilo or 3 kilos or whatever of food. We want to just use realistic data on what people eat. And the main input was dietary surveys. So these are very, very common in Europe and the US. So in the US, you've got the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, the dietary component of which is called What We Eat in America. Most European member states have a nationally representative food consumption survey as well. And the idea is you survey over 1,000 people. You look at their complete diet for 1 to 7 days. So in the US database, you have 2 days for every consumer. And you have additional demographic information as well. So you have real data on what foods people eat, what frequencies, what amounts. You have their body weights and genders and other different measures of health status and so on. So it's very, very useful for refining your exposure assessment. So you don't need to assume anymore that people consume a default amount of food. Using that data, this is the kind of algorithm that we developed, and I'm going to step through it in a lot more detail. But the basic idea is this: you pick a substance that's present in food packaging. Given that you've started with a certain substance, you need to know all the food packaging that contains that substance, and then you need to know all foods that are used with that packaging. With that information, if you have a migration model, you can then calculate the level of migration into food, link it with the food consumption data, and having all of those inputs, then you can collate all your different combinations and look at what the distribution of exposure is in the population. So probabilistic modeling is a word that people often use to describe these type of methods, and people are often a little afraid or uncomfortable with the idea. But the one thing I'll say is all you're trying to do is reflect real-world variability. We know in reality that all of these inputs are variable. They're not single numbers. So probabilistic modeling is just a method of simulating that variability on a computer. That's all it is. There's no smoke and mirrors or anything else involved. So going through these steps in a bit more detail. How do we know what packaging contains a given substance, and how do we know what foods are contained in that packaging? So we want to link, basically, given that somebody consumes a food, we want a probability or likelihood that that food contains a substance of concern, and we want to know what the level or the concentration is. So we took all the food consumption data for the countries in Europe that we were looking at, and we recoded it into a system that was targeted at food packaging use. So the food categorization systems that are using consumption databases aren't normally geared towards packaging use, but we recoded them in a way that was much more informative. So, and it was a tiered system as well. So you'd have like P.8, 0.1.1 would be fresh meat. We then defined what was called a pack type. So a pack type was considered to be a combination of 4 components. So components are the main, so it'll be the main structure of the packaging. You can have a closure then, which could be something like a sealed lidding or a screw top for a beverage bottle. You can have an outer, which would be like an outer wrap that would be used in food, and you can also have an insert. So this would be if in things like ready-to-eat meats or cheeses or the drip trays that are present in meat trays. Those are things that have direct food contact as well, so they're food packaging and they need to be considered. So we only looked at direct food contact materials as well, or packaging as well. Then for those components, we need to know what the structure of them is. So packaging is usually a multi-layer structure, sometimes they're monolayers, but we need to know what the composition is. We need to know the composition of those materials, and then you need to know the level of the chemical substance in those materials. Having all those different inputs then means you can link the substance to a given food consumption event. And the data was gathered to do this. So it can be done, and we did it. It nearly killed me, but we did it. More detail on the pack type information. So the key input here we used was market survey data, and Euromonitor International are a market survey company, and out of the box they had a data set that gave, at a retail level, market shares of different food packaging structures. So we were able to recode this data into the Facet food coding system, and we had the different packaging types by food category. It also gave us the pack size, so in grams, how big was the pack size. We had the different contact areas because we had the geometry of the different packaging, and we had the market shares. So given that somebody consumes a food, we know the likelihood that it was in one packaging type or another. So this really, really cool data set gave us this information out of the box. We didn't even have to go gather it. So, and it was good to see Mintel was a database that was discussed as well as providing refinement. Market study databases or market study companies have fantastic data that can be used to refine risk assessment. And I'm always preaching how these are data sources that should be explored in more detail. So on to the next question of how we calculate migration of a substance. So we know the different packaging types. How do we calculate the migration of a substance going from food packaging into food? Well, we use a migration model. So the MigraTest model was mentioned this morning. Fabez, the company who developed this model, were a partner in the project in collaboration with the Fraunhofer Institute and FERA in the UK. With lots of people, and with a massive experimental regime, and migration modeling was a huge part of this project. And we had the job of implementing the migration model on computer as well. So the inputs into the migration model are quite important. And Tim presented the fixed second law of diffusion. He showed the solution. This is the mathematical statement of it, and it's the last equation I'm going to present, I promise. So the inputs you need into this model are the thicknesses of the different layers, reflecting again the fact that packaging is a multi-layer system usually. You need the contact area, the densities of the different layers. Again, all of these things are generally known. You need to know the time and temperature regimes the packaging will undergo when in contact into food. You need to know the concentration of the migrant or the substance that can be present in one or more layers. And then you need two physiochemical parameters. So one is the diffusion coefficient, and this is like the kinetic component that measures how readily a substance can move within a given layer. And the other one that we need is the partition coefficient, which is the kind of the thermodynamic component that shows the relative likelihood or affinity a given material has for a substance when the two layers are in contact, and how easily a substance can jump from one layer to another. By far and away, the hardest thing to work out is the partition coefficient. And this is if we're going to do more work in the migration modeling area, I would strongly advise that it be in the area of partition coefficients, because this is by far the most important determination of your migration, and it's the hardest thing to estimate. And if people are interested in more details about all this stuff, I'm happy to talk about it further. So, linking, again, foods to migratory substances. I want to talk about it again and just show how we, again, going through the same data, how we pick up all of those inputs that we need for the migration model. So again, we start with our consumption diary. We know that somebody eats a given food, and we know the amount of food that they consume. We took the Euromonitor data and we recoded it, and we developed a thing called the PASTA table, which has nothing to do with pasta. It stands for pack, size, type, and association table. So this data tells us what pack type and probability of pack type the food consumed likely came in, give us this market share, which is a measure of just a probability, the size of the pack type. And we also said, well, given that we have different components, what sector of the packaging industry is responsible for it? So is it flexible packaging Europe? Is it the paper and board industry? Is it the the metal packaging industry. And then that tells us in a kind of decision tree kind of way, well, what industry source do we go to? So if it was Flexible Packaging Europe, we go to their database, and they gave us thousands and thousands of lines of data on the composition of the different packaging structures that exist in the European market, the layer thicknesses, the materials that were used, the time temperature regimes that the packaging undergoes. And all of this information was then linked to the level of substance in those materials, which again was provided by another company. So this again was presented in a kind of statistical distribution with a probability of occurrence as well, because not all materials will contain a given functional additive. And you need to factor that information in when you're doing your risk assessment. All of this information is obviously very proprietary and very confidential, and is the intellectual property of all the different companies. So what we did was we took all of that data, we anonymized it, we didn't point back to any specific company, and we put it in an encrypted database. So you can use this data in a risk assessment, but you can't view the raw data. So this is a solution we often use actually in these kind of projects, where we need to use confidential data to refine a risk assessment, because this is often one of the barriers to doing this. But we anonymize it, and if needs be, we encrypt it. I would say it's worth making this more open and transparent. That's beyond my pay grade, but in any case, it's a solution to this problem that is always faced. Regulators want more detail. Industry don't want to give away their IP. There is a halfway house that kind of, you can do things that are representative of the entire market. So the other two inputs that we need then, like I said, we need a diffusion coefficient. This can be calculated as a function of the molecular weight, the temperature of the system that you're looking at, and then you have two material-specific parameters. They're called AP prime and tau. This is an equation, it's called the Piringer equation. A lot of this work in migration modeling was led by a guy called Otto Piringer, who's the guy who founded the Fabis company. We need to calculate the partition coefficients. We developed a number of different methods of this. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there's one method that uses the vapor pressure index method based on Henry constants, and then there's another one that we used that was more empirically driven, that was based on regression and the log P of the substance. And this is an area I think that we need a lot more research in. As well as that, we have the densities and foods of the different foods and materials. And again, this was all provided for all the different combinations that we had in a database. And because these databases were all structured and we had a way of having them to talk to each other for a given substance, in principle, we had all the nuts and bolts of information that we needed to be able to answer the question of exposure. So then, on the food consumption part, we had 8 countries in the project providing data on food consumption. So I think between them they provided about 15 different dietary surveys. So some countries had multiple surveys for different age groups. And all of these were recoded into one system. So unfortunately, we're not the United States of Europe. Every country within the European Union does things in their own way. And in particular with dietary surveys, because of their own diets and their own foods, they code their foods in specific ways. So we had to harmonize all this into one system. Finally, we want to calculate exposure. So hopefully I've convinced you that we have all the different inputs that you need to be able to come up with a refined estimate of how much people consume foods and the concentration of the substance in those foods. That concentration data we'd normally pre-calculate. So we'd iterate through all the different combinations. We use what are called Monte Carlo simulations, which is just random simulations on computer that reflect the variability of all your different inputs. And we develop a database of chemical occurrence. And when we calculate exposure, then we have a measure of the likelihood that the chemical is present and a measure of the variability of the chemical occurrence. And that means then you can break your exposure down by contributing packaging type or by food category. So in terms of the risk assessment question, if you want to answer risk assessment beyond the kind of worst case scenario, you need to have a lot of data to underpin it. And if you want to understand risk and you want to take a risk management measure, you really got to have a refined risk assessment, because otherwise a worst case scenario doesn't tell you anything about what's really happening. So risk management, I would always argue, requires refined risk assessment. So finally, we need to combine all the exposures to give a distribution of exposure in the population, and this is what the software does. So these are a couple of screenshots. This is dietary exposure to a food chemical present in food packaging, broken down by contributing packaging type. So this is the power of this approach. You can see how different packaging types are contributing to your exposure in the population. And again, if you want to make a risk management decision, you have a lot more information with which to do it. Equally, you can break your exposure down by contributing food categories, so see what foods are driving your exposure in the population. So a lot of this work has been published in the scientific literature. The chairman of the Facet Industry Group was a guy called Peter Oldring, who did a Trojan amount of work within the project. We've 2 publications on the development of the tool, and then to validate the exposure model, we went straight for the most contentious substance we could think of, which is BPA. All the databases were made as transparent as possible on BPA and the occurrence of it. And I should say for can coatings, we didn't use migration modeling, we used extraction data, so we had real experimental data. So we kind of uncoupled the exposure model from the migration model to be able to validate that the migration model is, or the exposure model is giving us the estimates that we expect. And we also did a separate publication in a journal called Coatings Tech, which is a kind of a tech industry journal on how we gathered all the data as well. So if people wanted to repeat the process, there was some guidance out there. Software is freely available. You can download it from the European Commission's website. They host it. They're the ones, if you have any queries, you can just register and download it. I'd encourage you to do so. We have a new version coming out hopefully in the next month, which will be the final iteration of it. It's a desktop software application, so it's a large installer. It's over 1 gigabyte in size. We're a cloud computing company. This is the only thing that we do in desktop. I can tell you with certainty this is the last time we're ever going to do a desktop software as well. Everything, future iterations of this project will definitely be available on the web. And again, if you have any questions on it, you can email me or the European Commission's JRC. They'll be happy to answer. Thank you for your attention.
Any questions?
Is there going to be any follow-up to address the gap by the lack of Germany data for the FACET tool?
So the issue there is with Germany as a member state making their food consumption data available. If they made it available, we'd quite happily use it, but unfortunately they weren't a partner in the project and that data is not publicly available.
And they don't want to?
I'm not sure, have they been approached recently? They were when we were forming the project. But in general, there's a massive issue in Europe about sharing food consumption data. It's something that I've a huge bee in my bonnet about. I don't think it's a healthy way for the transparency of science and risk assessment. But so yeah, as of this moment, the German data is not going to be integrated. That's a very good question, and it's a very interesting question too. So we did, and I mean, you can do this by running an assessment in the software. The Euromonitor data is actually broken down by country, so it's the retail data at a country level of what the different packaging types are. And equally, the food consumption is country specific as well. However, the material and packaging composition is European wide. So any differences you see are actually due to different retail market shares of packaging on the market, like in a supermarket, and differences in food consumption. So you can see this, and again, the two things that are driving it are difference in what foods that people eat and the different packaging structures that are available in that country. Yes, yeah, we did. Nothing profound, though, I would say. Everything was in the same order of magnitude in any validation studies that we did.
I was kind of curious about one thing, and it's the assumption of the food mass to area ratio. How much uncertainty in the exposure assessment is accounted by differences that might occur by food type of that ratio? And I'll give an example. If you think about going to the big bulk stores, you have a larger mass of food or larger volume of food per that. You think about different cultures and different types of foods, you might have something where the amount of food to the packaging is very high in a small sort of package. But then also, combined with that, is there certain types of food that inherently you have a very low consumption rate of the food. So just assuming the food to packaging ratio without actually taking a look at the consumption by type of food to package, how much uncertainty in this exposure assessment might be accounted for those, unaccounted variables?
So I think it was accounted for to an extent in that the Euromonitor data gave you the different pack types on the market and also the size of the packaging. So the amount of food that was in different packaging types and the geometry. So that was used to give you a surface to volume ratio for that packaging in contact with the food. So we had some granularity in that input. In terms of if there's different consumption, like a smaller consumption rate of a given food that might be, for example, in contact with a packaging with a high surface to volume ratio, that would kind of come out in the wash because we're just using the raw food consumption data to estimate our exposure. So hopefully that kind of answers how we address that. So I think it's accounted for to a good degree. On the question of uncertainty analysis, which was actually its own little work package within the project, there was a whole set of what are called uncertainty tables, which are kind of a structured way of reporting and mapping uncertainties that are in line with the European Safety Authority's guidance document for uncertainty analysis. And those are things that you can download and look at when you run an assessment. So you can look at what uncertainties are in your assessment too. So that was an effort to try and make things as transparent when you're using the tool for risk assessment.
Okay, thank you. Cian?